Hi, I'm artist Andrew Denman, and thanks for joining me again as I take you through my creative process step by step. In this chapter, I'll show you how I paint sky and clouds. This will include an in-depth look at transparent glazing and also how best to manage painting wet on wet with acrylics. Because of the specific techniques I'll be using to paint the tiger, it's important to preserve a clean, white surface. As such, before I can start work on the sky, I'll need to mask him out. I cut a very rough mask from paper, carefully place it on the painting surface, and then affix it in place with painter's grade masking tape. I then use the tape to very carefully seal all the edges. It's also important not to paint over the ground surface, and a tape line will help to ensure a nice, clean contrast between sky and ground. But tape is far from adequate to mask a clean, organic, curvilinear edge. To preserve the subtle curves of the contour of the tiger, I'll need to employ a liquid mask. I've used many masking agents over the years and have found the Richardson Shiva mask to be far superior. Many masks come in awkward, easily clogged, and hard to clean dispensers, whereas Shiva can simply be applied with an old brush. Once the mask is dry, and before serious work on the sky can begin, I use opaque acrylic to patch those areas where my impasto underpainting was unintentionally sanded off down to the white of the board. Next begins the very important process of color mixing. Because I'll be using these colors wet on wet, I mix the paint with a palette knife without using any water or other medium. Acrylics tend to dry a bit darker than the color you see on your palette, so when I feel like I may be close to the proper hue and value, I paint the color on a scrap of paper and hit it with a hairdryer, and then compare it to the photo reference. I make whatever adjustments are necessary, in this case an admixture of white, and then repeat this process until I'm satisfied, constantly checking how the color looks when it's dry before I move on. When I'm satisfied that I have the right color and have mixed an adequate amount for the job at hand, a recycled film container is a great way to store the color for future use. When my full range of colors is thus prepared, I do a quick trial blend on a scrap of paper, just to be certain that I like the final effect before moving on. I prepare a palette with my premix colors plus white and begin work. My goal here is to create smooth blends, but you'll note that I am slightly thinning the paint with water to make it semi-transparent. I want to soften the textures of the impasto underpainting, but I certainly don't want to lose them entirely. In order to be successful, this technique must be performed with great speed. If the glaze dries as I work, smooth blends will be impossible. It's also important to have a large, dry, flat brush at the ready to feather over the glaze and eliminate brush strokes. Once I've made sure the paint is dry, I use a very fine sandpaper to bring out the texture where my glaze work may have been too heavy-handed. Then reapply another layer of glaze where further softening is required. The result is a much smoother, subtler sky than my initial impasto underpainting afforded alone. When mixing colors for the clouds, I use exactly the same process with one addition, the use of an extender or retarding medium. A retardant slows the drying process by perhaps a few minutes, but those few minutes can be the difference between a successful blend or not. When my full range of colors is finally ready, it's time to transfer in the shape of the cloud. Once again, I bring out the transfer copy of my original study. First, I line up the registration marks on the study with the registration marks on the board. Then I trace over the contour lines only, applying good pressure with a hard lead pencil in order to transfer the necessary guidelines onto the painting. Additionally, I'll transfer lines to let me know where to stop painting. I'll not make an effort to carefully paint around any of these areas because that would be even more time-consuming, but I also don't want to make unnecessary work for myself. Similarly, I'll make a few reference points on the study, just to help me get my bearings as I start to paint. When the study comes off, I'm left with exactly what I need: faint but easily visible lines. Next, I set up a palette with all of my carefully premixed colors and begin work blocking in the clouds. I have several main goals here, namely establishing basic color and value placements, establishing contours, and beginning rudimentary blending. Another major goal at this point is coverage. As such, I use the paint very dry and blend from one color and value to another by scumbling wet paint into wet paint with a very dry brush. The only water I use here is to rinse out the brush between colors, and I constantly have a paper towel at the ready to squeeze as much moisture from the brush as I can before going back for more paint. At this point, the advantage to premixing colors should be clear. Because acrylic paint dries so quickly, there is never time to mix colors as I paint, not when soft and subtle blending is a serious goal. Moreover, I can stop or start wherever I want, and colors and color transitions will remain consistent because the colors and values have remained consistent from the start. When I begin work on the second coat, my blending is more refined, in large part because painting on top of a consistent undercoat allows my brushstrokes to disappear. Another preoccupation at this stage is edges. Because I save my sky colors from before, I'm able to subtly soften the edges of the clouds by scumbling wet cloud colors into wet sky colors. Because I premix consistent hues and values, I can do this delicate work in small, manageable areas while maintaining seamless transitions. Next, I remove the mask in order to prepare for another, slightly unusual technique. It may seem crazy to take even a fine sandpaper to the blending I just so carefully completed, but I want the lower portion of the sky as it nears the horizon to appear rougher, less well-formed than the rest of the clouds, and no technique communicates this sense of rustic improvisation quite like sandpaper. When I'm done sanding, I reapply the mask to the tiger before doing some semi-transparent glaze work. Much of my work is a 2 steps forward, 1 step back approach, and that's certainly the case here. My goal is to soften, but not to obliterate, the sanding effect I've just achieved. I've left the upper portion of the clouds untouched by sanding, but it still needs glazing. Using a lot of water and my most transparent golden yellows, ochres, and siennas, among others, I glaze some warmth into the clouds. One of the downsides of premixing is that it limits color variation because the palette is so rigorously controlled, and this can have a stilted, artificial effect. Glazing in this manner is a way to reintroduce subtle variations that add depth, range, and veritas. Lastly, using a mixture of titanium white and cad yellow deep hue, I add in some bright, warm highlights to make the clouds pop. While not terribly complicated per se, this process is, like everything I do, very gradual and accretive, but in the end, the results speak for themselves. Thanks for watching. Tune in next time as I take an in-depth look at painting fur. That's right, it's finally time to start work on the tiger.